The American Colonies and its Literature, from the Earliest Days to 1750. So first of all, we need to have a good understanding as to why the Puritans and Pilgrims left England in the first place. In the early 17th century, that's the early 1600s, England contains a large number of migrant farmhands and unemployed and underemployed workers. So there was a surplus of the lower classes. Most English migrants to North America were recruited from the lower working population, farm workers, urban laborers, and artisans who were suffering from economic distress, including sharply falling wages. The Europeans made it to America in 1492, and some of the English came to America for freedom of religion, but others came for the promise of wealth. Most of them came because many of the English believed that Great Britain and the church were becoming too powerful. The colonial period lasts from about 1620 to 1750. Newly arrived colonists who create villages and towns and establish new governments while protesting the old ways in Europe. They did not consider themselves Americans until about the mid-18th century. They were still the English. And there was an enormous displacement of Native American civilizations because of the European immigrants. So what kind of writing did they do? Their writing was very practical. All the writers were amateurs, and the writing is instructive. There's a plain style, very simple and direct. Everything about Puritan life was about necessity and work, and there wasn't a lot of emphasis on education apart from the type of education that the Bible provided and basic reading, writing, and math. So the writing was intended to be instructional. Now that we are in this new land, how do we thrive? How do we survive even from winter to winter? And the writers were amateurs. They were just chronicling their existence to some degree. So the literature of the time. The only literary forms found in the Bible were acceptable, and all forms of fiction was despised. So there was no storytelling unless it was a story from the Bible. The explorers were navigators and explorers, not writers. People that came in and settled America, the Spanish, the French, and so on, they were not here to chronicle the beauty of the land. They were simply here to see what was going on, to make maps, and to find their way around and to get back to Europe. Flyers and pamphlets promoted a new life across the sea. So there was a huge ad campaign to get people to leave Europe and come to America. The King James Bible was published in 1611, and that became really the only major book of the time. And newspapers thrived, but there were a lot more newspapers in Europe than there were in America. We also have a smattering of journals and diaries where people chronicled their day-to-day life, and that's how come we know what life was like back in those days. There were also a series of letters that went from the colonists back to friends and family in England. So there are some representative authors. Jonathan Edwards, and he wrote sermons. He was a minister. William Bradford, who wrote a journal. Mary Rowlandson, who wrote a captivity narrative, and Anne Bradstreet, who wrote poetry. And these are the main writers of colonial America. I have a few rhetorical questions that I want you to think about. And as I ask the questions, pause the video and either think about your answer or jot down a few notes. What religious beliefs characterize your church's denomination? Does your church have practices that may seem rigid and strict to others? What style of preaching does your church leader have? Have you ever been to a church and were fearfully affected by the sermon? Think about why. So now the Puritans and their beliefs. In the mid-1600s, the Puritans were English Protestants who wanted to purify the Church of England and rid it of all Roman Catholic practices. They left for the New World in 1620 to escape religious persecution and establish the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So here's a list of religious beliefs and practices. The religious beliefs. Puritans believed that all humans are born with sin, and they believed in predestination, which is God has already figured out who is going to heaven and who is going to hell before they've even been born. They did not regard leading a godly life as the cause of a person's salvation, but rather as an encouraging sign to the effect of being chosen by God. And the way people knew whether you were saved was by your good deeds. The uncertainty of one's eternal fate only made believers redouble their efforts to purify their own lives and society as a whole. The church's officials were also the government officials. The religious practices. They emphasized a strict adherence to biblical principles and rejected the worldliness of society. So all of the fancy adornments from the Catholic religion, the beautiful cathedrals and the various chalices and whatnot, they thought was unnecessary. They actually thought that that was taking away from the goodness of God. Hard work was an honor to God, and everyone should pursue moral purity down to the smallest detail. Anytime there was anything evil, any sickness, the devil was behind it. The Puritan Way of Life. The Puritans put God and hard work first in their life, and we actually see the remnants of this in the Puritan work ethic that we still kind of have here in America. They believed in a strict conformity and a very strict version of God. They wore very simple clothing, and they did not allow dancing. They believed that sex was for reproductive purposes only. They believed that witches and witchcraft were real, and that they were tests from the devil. They worked together as a community to build their towns, but this often led to a fear of outsiders and of nonconformity. The Puritans believed in a fire and brimstone method of preaching and led lives in fear of an angry God. Puritan children. In 1692, children were expected to behave under the same strict code as the adults, even babies. Children completed their chores, attended church services, showed no emotion, no excitement, no fear, no anger. Disobedience was severely punished, and the children rarely played as toys and games were scarce. Jonathan Edwards, he wrote Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, which is a famous sermon. Some basic information about him. He was the son and grandson of Puritan ministers. He was ordained a minister at an age of 23, and he believed deeply in predestination. He's known for his preaching of terror, kind of scaring people straight. His sermon was preached in 1741 and became the most famous sermon in America to this day. William Bradford, and he wrote of Plymouth Plantation, which was a journal. At the age of 17, he became a separatist, which means he was a Puritan who wanted to break away from the Church of England. With others, he decided to establish a colony in the New World, and he helped write the Mayflower Compact, which was the colony's rules of government, and he became a governor of the colony. Anne Bradstreet is the first American poet. In 1630, she sailed to America with her family as part of the Great Migration of Puritans. Her father served as the governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony, off and on from about 1634 to 1650. Her husband was also governor from 1679 to 1686. Anne Bradstreet wrote many poems that chronicled the daily existence of her life.